potentially a next book project, but it's really in its incipient stages at this point. I think I will begin by actually sharing a set of slides, inshallah, if I manage to overcome any technical difficulties that might occur in the process. But inshallah, please let me know if you can see this.
Perfect.
Wonderful. You can see it then, inshallah.
Yes, excellent.
Barakallah fikum. So I'm just going to talk about the subject of secularism, and I do apologize. The image on the screen seems to have some sort of potentially problematic images on it, but in any case, I mean, this is something I've taken off the internet. So the meaning of secularism in Islamic reading. The category of secularism, and it's one of the sort of major themes of contemporary thought. Modernity is often characterized as secular, but you know, it's Islam and secularism is often seen as like it's a dichotomy that is seen as being in conflict very often, and it's an area where Muslims need to engage in a sense to be able to stake their claim on the public sphere, on sort of how they fit into a modernity that has been dominated by Euro-American, sort of European and North American powers. And so in that spirit, I'm hopefully going to engage in a series of reflections which reflect the current status of my research, actually. So, you know, I have miscellaneous writings on some of these topics, but they haven't really been sort of brought together into a coherent whole quite yet. So please keep me in your du'as that I'm able to do that. But I happen to think that this is incredibly important for Muslims to be thinking about, particularly, you know, I'm very fortunate to be able to speak to a Canadian audience. The Canadian Muslim community is, you know, one of the most educated and most affluent communities probably of Muslims in the world. And so in these sorts of circles where you have, to a certain extent, the resources to be able to engage in reflections in these areas, I think this is particularly important for us to reflect on. Although it is important in all spaces. I am beaming into Canada from the UK. And in Britain, just as an example, recent sort of economic demographic data suggests that 50% of Muslim households live in poverty. Very different sort of demographic reality to much of North America, although in America in particular, we also have a lot of African-American brothers and sisters who are similarly kind of in great difficulty and very often not acknowledged within the broader Muslim community as you know, well-integrated sort of members. So we have challenges wherever we happen to be, but where we have greater resources, we have greater responsibilities before Allah. So it's in that spirit that hopefully this will be of some benefit. And I'm going to try and sort of, hopefully we won't have any technical glitches. Please let me know if there are any concerns. And if I recall correctly, I have roughly an hour to speak. I will assume that's around 50 minutes from here on, inshallah, based on sort of the time I've already spent speaking. And let me begin by just sort of setting out a series of questions. What is secularism? What is Islam? And why are they important? Hopefully I've kind of explained a little why they are important. And hopefully it's, you know, the importance of Islam is self-explanatory for anyone who is attending the sort of Center of Islamic Knowledge. But let's briefly, and this will be familiar material, so I'll go over this reasonably quickly. But let's define Islam, and I'm taking a relatively sort of mainstream, you could say a mainstream Sunni approach, considering that I'm citing Bukhari and Muslim as sort of reference points here. Although I think, you know, in many respects, you know, this is cross-denominational, and for this would be something that applies to most Muslims. When it comes to defining Islam, how do we understand Islam? You have the famous hadith of Jibril, and I apologize, I haven't included a translation here, but I'm not going to read the Arabic in any great detail, but for those of you who are familiar with Arabic, you'll see here Islam is defined as that you testify that that Allah is, that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is messenger, and the rest of the 5 pillars. And then this is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ is basically speaking to Jibreel, and that's a reveal that takes place at the end of the hadith. But it mentions, defines Islam in a certain way, defines Iman or faith in 6 pillars, and also defines Ihsan. From this, the ulama very often will talk about the fact that these 3 develop into the disciplines of Aqidah in sort of the more mature tradition, Aqidah, fiqh, and tasawwuf, for example. But the point being that Islam is something that can be encapsulated in a very small hadith like this. There are certain aspects which are aspects of belief, Iman in 6 pillars. There are aspects of practice, so the 5 pillars of Islam, which are related to worship. And then there are other, what you could describe as more spiritual practices. This is relatively familiar terrain, inshallah. And as ever, if anyone has any questions, you can sort of always ask, inshallah. Now, with respect to, this is a nice, someone on the internet, I've taken it from them. They've done a kind of nice breakdown of how Islam, Iman, and Ihsan kind of divide up into our understanding of Islam as a whole. And you can see, one of the things that is worth highlighting in this particular instance is when we, in the context of thinking about secularity and secularism, is that, having certain beliefs is seen as perfectly legitimate within the religion-secular divide, so that falls on religion. And I'm talking in conventional terms. In terms of esoteric dimensions, thinking about ethics and thinking about sort of search for divine truth, and this is also kind of an extension of certain types of worship that also falls under what would be considered religion in modern Western terms. The ibadat, the 5 pillars, prayers, fasting, pilgrimage, these also fit under the 5 pillars. But for modern conceptions of religion that have come out of the sort of post-Reformation context, the post-Enlightenment context, which is very much a European story, these other aspects that religion has to say much or anything about some of these aspects, particularly these aspects towards the bottom, is seen as wrong. It's seen as inappropriate, seen as potentially perverse, potentially dangerous. And this is what makes, the interaction between Islam and secularity particularly, or, secularism as conceived of in the present, particularly interesting from an intellectual perspective, but potentially concerning from an Islamic or from a religious perspective. And it's something that we need to think about and we need to reflect on, that rules of interpersonal contract. So rules of contract, and contract can have various forms in trade and commerce, in marriage, in inheritance, but also in terms of how you conduct governance, how you set up a judiciary, and the sort of the rule of law system on the basis of which that judiciary will operate. These are concerns of Islam as well. I'm being told there's interruption in the audio. Please let me know if that continues to take place. If it does, I will try and use an external mic. But at the moment, if that continues to be the problem, please do let me know, inshallah. So I also wanted to highlight, I don't want to be entirely dismissive of these kinds of new attempts at redefining, in a sense, what Islam is. And this comes in the form of a book, if I recall correctly, published in 2016, although I think I got my copy in 2015, so it might be 2015, called What is Islam? Actually, yes, so 2016, by Shahab Ahmed, a scholar who has passed now at Harvard University. And he very deliberately chose the coin. This is a Mughal coin with Jahangir, one of the sort of very influential Mughal emperors, and he's carrying a wine cup. And Shahab Ahmed, in part, is arguing, well, this is also Islam, that the distinction between sort of the cultural practices of Muslims and Islam itself do not need to be made so sharply. And, I think that there are some interesting sort of debates that are taking place in the present, in the modern period. I would strongly disagree with Shahab Ahmed's sort of equalizing, in a sense, the Islamic and the Islamic and the sort of the behaviors of Islamic cultures and so on. And it's widely known that very often the political classes in Muslim societies did engage in this sort of, alcohol consumption and so on. But without going off completely on a tangent, I would suggest, at the very least, that they recognize that this is wrong, or that this is not in keeping with Islam. And the other sort of aspect of this, of course, is theologically speaking, it's pretty sort of clear and unequivocal that if someone doesn't reject something which is, something like alcohol drinking as being impermissible when it is explicitly mentioned in the Quran, at the very least wine or khamr, then that actually is considered to be a form of rejecting the scripture itself, which constitutes disbelief. But it's worth knowing that these sorts of alternative paradigms are taking hold, and I think they, or at least are sort of have a certain degree of prominence in the present. And in my view, this is actually a reflection of the strength and the power of Western hegemony on a global scale. It's inevitable that there will be borrowings, there will be influence of that kind. And at the end of the day, there will be sort of engagements, and we'll have to see what sort of makes it through that contestation. But I think that when it comes to sort of these sorts of categories, we should bear in mind the difference between the religious and the academic as well. And I will not dwell on this much further, because actually it's somewhat tangential to my major concern, which is secularism. Now, how do we define what secularism is? It's arguably a lot more difficult to define than the way in which I define Sunni Islam. Sunni Islam has a community which is very clear, or reasonably clear, and they are, largely agreed on certain minimal definitions of what constitutes Islam. And the Gabriel Hadith Jibril, as it's called in Arabic, is one of those sort of really minimal definitions. It's very helpful in that way. Secularism, on the other hand, is an idea which, is far more open to contestation and has far more disagreement about it. Of course, I'm saying here, sort of the same could be said about Islam. If you go beyond the Sunni umbrella, then of course there's a lot more contestation. Once you go into the Shi'i community, to the Ibadi community, and if you go broader beyond the sort of mainstream Shia community into what's known historically as the Ghulat, or the sort of, it's a bit odd to translate it as the exaggerators, so to speak, but those who went to excess in the view of kind of the heresiographers, then you come to realize actually there is a lot of contestation even within Islam writ large. And we could, if people are interested, we can discuss how sort of Sunni theologians dealt with this. And Al-Ghazali has an elegant, sort of, in my view, a reasonably elegant answer to some of these sorts of questions. But when it comes to secularism, how do we negotiate the various different conceptions? So let's look at some of these conceptions. I've kind of referenced secularism as an essentially contested concept, and I'm referencing a notable sort of philosopher from the mid-20th century, W.B. Gailey, who, or Galli, I don't know exactly how to pronounce his name, who describes certain concepts as essentially contested, that we might say, we all say justice is good, right? And we all want sort of justice, or in modern Western countries, you generally have democracies. But exactly what constitutes justice, or exactly what constitutes democracy, is actually highly contested in ways that would be completely unrecognizable from one conception to another conception. And so in that similar way, secularism is often viewed, as I sort of signaled with the first slide, as the kind of separation of church and state. And that view is actually sort of also been critiqued by a Canadian scholar, right? So it's somewhat sort of fortuitous that Canada's actually produced one of the most important theorists of secularism in sort of recent years, Charles Taylor. And he basically argues that this conception of a separation of church and state, it happens to be a historical practice of how secularism was realized. But even that historical practice is actually quite complicated. And what it meant actually was the separation of the state from individual Christian denominations. So various competing Christian denominations, no one of those various denominations could dominate the federal state, for example, in the United States. Whereas, that's in the North American context. And he basically argues, even in that North American context, there was a unanimous view, more or less, that the state did have a kind of Christian identity. So we're disagreeing between different Christian groupings, but the state still has a kind of religious identity. We're talking 18th, 19th century United States. Now, as soon as we're talking about separation of church and state as the meaning of secularism, you're already seeing that this is very Christian in its history. In the Islamic tradition, we don't really talk about a church. In the way that an institution developed and a papacy developed, there isn't a comparable development in the Islamic tradition. And so arguably, you're already recognizing that secularism has a European history. And one might even say it's a Eurocentric concept. Now, Charles Taylor, in another work, I've put A Secular Age up here because it's his most important work on secularism. It's a kind of history of the development and the rise of secularism, or the secular, as a dominant kind of form of being in the public in the West. But in another of his works, and he's written a couple, the one I'm thinking of is called The Polysemy of the Secular. He actually argues this conception of separation of church and state is not helpful. And it doesn't actually reflect what was the dynamic and the purpose behind sort of the rise of secularism in Europe and the United States or North America. Instead, he says that what was really going on, the maqasid behind these shifts that were taking place, if you may, was that you had an increasing state of pluralism, different denominational circumstances with respect to Christians. And as a consequence of that, it was necessary to manage that pluralism in a reasonable and fair way that didn't give any single group a monopoly over control. And in this sort of sense, one of the things that he argues is that what we need in the modern state is a secular state that conducts itself, or the public sphere is managed through overlapping consensus, which is to say that points on which various different outlooks, religious or irreligious, incidentally. So, he kind of already is accepting that, non-religious outlooks can also have this, these worldviews that can compete with religious outlooks, something which will become a bit more relevant later on in my talk. And he's saying that secularism is about neutrality and managing pluralism. That's the essential purpose. So, that's one particularly influential sort of, in the philosophical domain. I'm not sure how influential it is in the public domain yet, but in the philosophical domain, that's one influential definition of exactly how we come to secularism. I'm going to look at a few others, or a couple of others, which disagree with Taylor to a certain extent. A notable example comes from Talal al-Asad, another comes from sort of Aziz al-Azma, or Aziz al-Azma, technically. And I've mentioned Taylor already. So, as I've mentioned, secularism is a highly contested concept. Talal al-Asad is a very interesting thinker. I'm not sure if he would consider himself Muslim, but he's engaging, I think, this debate. Certainly, he's not engaging it from an Islamic perspective per se. He's engaging in a sort of an anthropological exploration of the concept of the secular. And he basically, as I've suggested already, as one of the views on the origins of secularism, he highlights that secularism or secularity in the form that we experience it today is a distinctly European, sort of a product of European history. And he therefore suggests it can't just be, transposed onto the Muslim world in the way that, European colonial history and post-colonial history, in a sense, has tried to do and continues to do in many respects. Yet Taylor says in the sort of article I referenced that modern states must be secular in order for us to prevent persecution of minorities in particular. And so, he expresses concern about the rise of the BJP in India. This is something he wrote a long time ago, incidentally. He's been expressing that concern for a while, and there has been a lot of concern in secular circles within India about the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the current ruling party, and it is, well known for its kind of anti-Muslim or xenophobic orientation. On the flip side, so we've said Taylor, despite talking about sort of secularism as a kind of neutral space, he also insists on secularism as being essential and saying that actually it can be transported to non-European contexts, despite, he's an expert on the European sort of like genealogy of secularism. He's saying despite that history, it's actually essential for modern states to be secular. And this is something that we'll come to later on. As we've already indicated, Islam has stuff to say about the state specifically. So that can create a problem in a sense. And finally, I just wanted to highlight Aziz al-Azma, who is sort of the most, I would say, unreconstructed secularist in the groups that I've looked at. Very learned scholar, there's no question, a Syrian, I think possibly a Syrian Christian, but someone who is very much a secularist and really sort of thinks that this is the way the entire world should go. It's a natural development of global history. It's about the structural differentiation of modern societies, and the separation of religion is part of that natural sort of structural differentiation. That's one sort of arguably his viewpoint is the most dominant viewpoint in the public sphere and in public policy debates and things like that. There's an assumption that secularism is just something which is, if you want to be modern, you have to be secular, and everyone has to basically trace a European historical experience in order to be, part of modern civilization. Essentially, in my view, it's highly Eurocentric. So this comes to the next point, which I want to highlight, which is, what about the history of, quote unquote, the secular beyond Europe? And in this regard, I think people like Aziz al-Azma in particular can be seen as highly Eurocentric. Calling someone Eurocentric is not a very nice thing to do in academic circles, but I say this sort of with the caveat that it's not meant as an insult, but at the same time, I think that is a very fundamental problem in the way that he is arguing. And he's he's a very sort of capable scholar. I'm sure he will have his kind of justifications for his perspective, but I think that they are very problematic. And in a sense, what I would argue is part of the problem goes back to how do you even define religion, right? So the separation of religion and state as conceived of by someone like Aziz al-Azma, or indeed, even though Taylor is talking about the neutrality of the state, he's still talking about the fact that the state cannot adopt a religious sort of like orientation in the modern period. But what is religion? I mean, in a sense, we need to ask ourselves, how are you defining religion? If you want to engage in creating a secular public space, then what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a space where religion doesn't impinge in a very sort of like direct way on that public space. So you need to then define religion. And this is notoriously difficult. In fact, I recall Charles Taylor at the beginning of his book, A Secular Age, says something along the lines of, I will take a sort of somewhat cowardly path and basically say, not try and explore the definition of religion, but simply go with something along the lines of, believing in God of some kind. And, I think that I think that's a bit of a cop-out, personally, not just because, if you're going to define religion through theism, then you're excluding something like Buddhism, which is a non-theistic religion. And so, it starts to become messy in all sorts of ways. Bruce Lincoln, who is a very respected scholar of religion at the University of Chicago, and here's a book he wrote in 2001, straight after 9/11, published in 2002. And it was kind of like his effort to try and, make some kind of contribution to the entire debate relating to, in a sense, I believe he says in the preface, I felt this urgency to somehow do something, like everyone should like try and do something about what just happened. Those of you who may have been around when 9/11 took place, it was a traumatic experience for the West in a way that, they had probably never experienced from the outside. Of course, if you think about European history, they experienced World War II, and that was self-inflicted. It was basically a European civil war that globalized because, Europe controlled the world at the time. But, so in a sense, you can understand where Bruce Lincoln is coming from. And what's interesting is, he's one of the most, I think, one of the most subtle scholars of religion in the academy. And yet his definition, again, strikes me as sort of problematic in all sorts of ways. So he basically says religion consists of 4 components, and it's a long drawn out sort of definition, which I'm just giving like a Cliff Notes version of. He says, religion is a discourse, a practice, a community, and an institution. So the discourse has to be transcendent, but he never defines transcendent, which I find is fundamentally problematic. A practice is, that discourse, meaning, based on a scripture, for example, which comes, claims to be revealed, and then it gives access to revelation, and there around that scripture there is a practice. So if you think in the Quranic sense, or in the sort of in the Jewish community, you'll have liturgical practices where people recite the text as part of worship and things like that. There will be a community, so the people engaged in that practice will be part of that religion, and there will be an institution like a church. And institutions among social scientists don't mean that there has to be bricks and mortar. It's basically a series of ideas and norms that create a corporate structure of some kind, which might be a group of people where there are hierarchies of scholars versus, members of lay communities, and, they will engage in prayer together and so on. So, that sort of institution we're thinking about. But again, I think my main problem with this sort of a definition is, what does transcendent mean? Like what? And we'll come back to this point in a moment. Incidentally, just on the question of the history of the secular beyond Europe, I should give a shout out to a colleague of mine who's recently graduated from Harvard and has been based at Yale this year, and I think is going to Stanford next year. So Roshan Abbasi is, the author of the best work, in my view, on the history of secularism in the Islamic tradition, as it were. So he has done a very extensive study of exactly the conception of deen, which is published, but his PhD remains unpublished, where he explores, in a sense, the way in which Muslims dealt with the secular space, and the way in which they conceived of it as distinct from the religious space. So there was a deen dunyawi distinction, and Muslims engaged that distinction in a very particular way, which is very different from the way in which the Western sort of modern Western experience, and indeed the pre-modern Western experience that gave rise to the modern separation, a separation that doesn't really take place in the Islamic tradition. So I am going to now talk briefly about, I hope I have around 25 minutes. Is that please, correct?
Please take your time, Usaama, no rush.
Okay, fantastic. So thinking about, the concept of religion, and that's basically what I've been talking about for the last few minutes, we realize actually religion itself is an essentially contested concept, right? It's not agreed upon. And so if you go to something like the Oxford Dictionary of English, this is a 2-volume, it's not the Oxford English Dictionary, which is 20 volumes, but a 2-volume dictionary of current usage. It defines religion as the belief and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a god, a personal god or gods. Now, that is probably, very widespread in how people understand these sorts of, the concept of religion. But as I've mentioned already, this kind of doesn't account for something like Buddhism, for example. So Buddhism is, I believe, potentially the third largest religion, I'm putting it in inverted commas in light of this definition, in the world. And suddenly they've been excised from the community of religions, so to speak. Now, I'm going to look at another definition of Brent Nombre. We'll mention his longer sort of discussion of this in the next slide. So Brent Nombre is a scholar based, I don't know where exactly he's based, but he's published a book called Before Religion, published by Yale University Press, where he somewhat bluntly says religion actually, in practice, in the way that we use it, is anything that sufficiently resembles modern Protestant Christianity. So he's saying, when we say the word religion in the modern world, and I think he generalizes a bit too much, I think you can say this certainly in the English language. And as Muslims become, more and more users of the English language, even that will be contestable in my view. But he's saying, in the way that we use it, we actually just mean anything that sufficiently resembles modern Protestant Christianity. And the reason this is important, and we'll come to the rest of his definition in a moment, is that, again, it reflects a very Eurocentric sort of conception of what a religion is. Protestant Christianity is a product of the Reformation. 1517, Luther sort of has Martin Luther in sort of, I forget which city in Germany, but he basically, in a sense, instigates a rebellion against the church by saying we no longer accept the Catholic Church as what was at that point the entire church of Christianity, their authority. And as a consequence of that, we are going to now start our own, in a sense, protest against that sort of Christianity. And in the process of his career, I suppose, where he translated the Bible into a vernacular language, into German, he did these things which were, and he said that, people should be able to access scripture directly in a way that was not the norm in, Europe before then. And as a consequence of those sorts of moves, you have the rise of something called Protestant Christianity. Over the centuries, probably something which would have horrified Luther, I speculate here because I'm not an expert on Luther, Protestant Christianity becomes this kind of privatized religion. The church before Protestant Christianity, and the Vatican still, it's worth remembering the Vatican is a state, right? And it's arguably the longest lasting state in contemporary history. It's, I think, over 1,000 years old. And so, this is Martin Luther protested against the Catholic Church. And in the process, Christianity was transformed, at least Protestant Christianity, into a tradition that basically was a privatized religion. The Catholic Church has not accepted that, but in practice, given the way in which Europe has, secularized in a very sort of forceful way, in a sense, it has simply had to adapt to that modern reality. So let's just quickly have a look at the rest of his comment. He says, religion is anything that sufficiently resembles modern Protestant Christianity. Such a definition might seem crass, simplistic, ethnocentric, Christianocentric, and even a bit flippant, right? It is all of these things, but it is also highly accurate in reflecting the uses of the term in modern languages. Now, as I say, I think in modern English is perfectly reasonable. If we get to Arabic and other Islamic languages, I think it would be contestable, that sort of a claim. But what's interesting, and I want to link this to sort of William Cavanaugh's excellent book on called The Myth of Religious Violence, is the way in which religion in this conception develops at a certain point in time in European history in a way that, in a sense, gives rise to the secular as an independent domain of religion, than religion, so to speak. So I don't entirely agree with William Cavanaugh. I recommend anyone interested in sort of like religion and violence to read this book because it's quite an eye-opening read. But I don't necessarily agree with either Nombre or Cavanaugh's conceptions of religion as being kind of a modern invented concept, which both of them basically argue that there was no such thing as religion in, before the modern peoples invented it in this particular guise. And, one of the best treatments or critiques of that comes from Roshan Abbasi's published work. He's got a great article, a bit long, over 100 pages, but a great article on the idea of religion as it's found in the pre-modern Islamic tradition, in fact. So this slide basically is highlighting the way in which religion, as it's defined in the modern West very often, comes out of a certain history. And if we, in a sense, invert the way in which we look at religion, so inverting the gaze, as it were, what I want to suggest is secularism could be conceived of as a religion of sorts. Okay. And what do I mean by this? So ironically, of course, I'm kind of critiquing the Eurocentrism of the last few slides by appealing to another European author. And in another version of this lecture, I actually had talked about Ibn Taymiyyah as one of the sources of this sort of an argument. So Ibn Taymiyyah actually has a fascinating sort of risala called Al-Qa'ida fil Mahabba. And it's been translated now by Ahmed al-Shamsi, sections of it that are relevant. I'm not sure if it's been published yet. So Dr. Ahmed Shamsi is at Chicago University. But Ibn Taymiyyah actually has a very similar sort of definition to the concept of deen as someone like Émile Durkheim. So Durkheim, the famous French sociologist, publishes in 1912 Les formes élémentaires de la vie religieuse. And he basically is arguing that religion is a ubiquitous human phenomenon. So a Durkheimian conception of religion seems to suggest that all societies need to have religion in some form. So his definition of religion, and I hope this is reasonably accurate, it doesn't read very clearly to me, but it contains the sort of like definition that Durkheim sort of has in his book. A religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, what you can think of as muharramat. So haram or haram means sacred as well as forbidden. So he actually elaborates this. That is to say, he's elaborating sacred things that are set apart and forbidden. So that's what he means by sacred things. Beliefs and practices which unite us into one single moral community called a church, they unite into one single community called a church, all those who adhere to them. So, he's using the term church, but he's using it in a metaphorical sort of sense here, because one of the things to notice from Durkheim's sort of definition of religion is there's no reference to God. It's not that they believe in God, but they actually believe in certain things which are sacred, that are forbidden. And he kind of defines sacred as being things which are set apart and forbidden. And so, you have haram in all societies, including in sort of like secular society. Certain things are forbidden from, being done. And so he is suggesting essentially that, all societies are religious on some sort of, on some levels. Someone's, I think, asking a question. So I'm just going to respond very quickly to a couple of the questions, or if it's preferred by the organizers, I can wait until we come towards the end of this. But,
so Ustad, perhaps you could finish your prepared remarks, and at the end we can take the question.
Okay, I hope I'm not boring people too much, but I should be done in the next 15 minutes. So the point that I'd like to sort of highlight is that if we actually take Durkheim seriously, and I wouldn't be original in taking his kind of approach to the concept of religion. There are others who have done this as well, and I include Carlton Hayes in an essay from 1926, and he's got a book from 1960 as well, around 1960, called Nationalism, a Religion. But the essay, I think, summarizes in a sense the overall argument quite eloquently. Basically says, well, nationalism is a religion, right? It's the way in which people speak about the nation state or the nation, or the myths of founding, etc. It is a of transcendent importance to people. In fact, just one point I should make on the previous slide is one of the things that Kavanaugh points out is with respect to definitions where they appeal to something transcendent. He says, how do we define that? Like, why is that never properly defined in, I mean, perhaps never is overstating the case, but he points out that if we think about transcendence as actually being a reference to ultimate concern, people of all sorts of orientations do have an ultimate concern. The capitalist who, spends all their time, on the stock market, at the stock market and sort of trying to make their millions, has an ultimate concern, money, right? And so, in that same sort of way, various people can have various ultimate concerns. The use of the term transcendent in discourse in someone like Bruce Lincoln's definition, and as I say, I'm taking Bruce Lincoln because he is such a subtle sort of expert on the question of religion, but even here, for me, that entire sort of use of that term suggests that it's just a way of trying to make a special case of religion so that it can be separated from the secular. Because in the secular, you have practices, you have communities, you have institutions, and you have discourses indeed. And we'll come to that in just a moment, inshallah. So, what I'm suggesting is, can various modern ideologies also be viewed as religions, right? And perhaps there's, I've not come to this point in my research yet, but perhaps there's a point at which something like this becomes a religion. So when the secular is just a dimension of our existence, where you have the religious dimension and the purely secular dimension, which doesn't really have, the Quran and the Sunnah don't have very much to say necessarily about water, outside of devotion to salah and so on, or my drinking water. This is mubah, right? But even this, I would argue, can be made a religious act if I'm doing it with the right niyyah, right? If I'm saying Bismillah, etc. So it, in a sense, becomes an act of worship. But in a sense, what happens in the secular context is, once that becomes a holistic sort of worldview, then it potentially can be called religion. And that's hopefully what I will argue in what remains here. And actually, I should leave a bit of time to reflect on sort of what Muslims need to do with these sorts of ideas, or what. So could secular ideologies be considered religions? Depending on how one defines religion, we could actually view secularism and other secular ideologies like liberalism, like communism, fascism, indeed, although those have been described as religions in secular literature in the past, but they can be considered religion or religions. And these religions are ones in which the secular or the worldly, and I didn't really go into the genealogy of the secular, but of the term, but the secular realm has been converted into an all-encompassing system of some kind that has replaced traditional religions in its, in a sense, holistic conception of the world and life, etc. And so, if we do accept that, the modern era is, in a very ironic sense, considering the way its self-image is one of being a secular era, is a deeply religious one. So if you say that, various secular ideologies like liberalism are, can be conceived of as religions of some kind, you can describe them as secular religions if you like, then we still live in a deeply religious age, I think. And so let me close with just a few reflections about how this actually might work as, seeing religion in the secular. And I'm going to appeal to a book by a scholar, Israeli scholar, who happens to be a Zionist, and I obviously do not condone his championing I believe he's acted as a moral guide for the Israeli occupation forces, but he is also a brilliant scholar. And, he talks about, in this very short book, actually, but deeply insightful book, this notion of communities, text-centered communities. So a number of modern scholars note that Islamic perspectives, pre-modern and modern, do not really align to sort of Western conceptions and trends of secularization in the form that we've discussed so far that marginalizes religion. But these perspectives remain marginal in the sort of in the global context, but also in the academic context. In my estimation, because of the hegemony of secular ideology, you could say. So just speaking about Moshe Habitel's sort of notion of text-centered communities, let me take the notion of the modern state. So modern nation states can be considered, in a sense, religious entities of sorts. And this is, I should point out, I've not read Schmitt closely, but I understand that this is actually quite close to certain ideas that he has about political theology. And I'm not appealing to Schmitt per se. So Carl Schmitt, as a well-known German and Nazi sort of jurist who argued that modern political concepts derive from religious ones originally. But what I'm suggesting actually that not only do they derive, but they actually are in a sense. Modern nation states have founding sacred histories. They have founding myths of what it means to be, Britain or Canada or, the United States. And these are actually quite important to the identity of those states. These are taught at school level. There's, mass indoctrination, acculturation into these kinds of values. I would argue there are, the equivalent of sacred scriptures. Text-centered communities, as Moshe Habitel talks about in his book, they have to operate on the assumption that the text is true. And I would say that, constitutions, for example, the Constitution of the United States, essentially have to be treated as though they are true. They have to be appealed to in legal disputes and in political disputes, etc. And you have effectively in the judiciary a kind of clerical class that adjudicates those disputes, right? And the elected representatives also have a kind of clerical sort of role as well, because they're very often given the role of translating the sovereign will of the people into legislation, statute law and the like. And so I think there's a lot of very interesting comparisons to be made. And one of the ones that I like is the notion of judicial review, which is something, I don't know how embedded it is in Canadian law, but you have it in, to a certain extent, British law, and certainly it's quite deeply embedded in the US sort of judicial system. And so in a sense, you have a clerical sort of like ulama council, you could say, in a place like the United States, in the form of these unelected appointees in the Supreme Court who are, appointees for life, who vet legislation to see whether they are in line with the sacred scriptures, the constitutions, or, I'm being a bit sort of metaphorical here, obviously. I also find the concept of inequality to be one of the sort of myths of secular, sort of modern secularity, because you do have in-groups and out-groups, citizens and aliens, to use the North American terminology. And so, it's fascinating in my estimation when people talk about, in an Islamic context. And I'm not saying that these are uncomplicated questions and challenges for the Islamic tradition to deal with in the modern context, but I find it highly unusual to think about, talking about, non-Muslims were second-class citizens in Muslim societies. I mean, in Western societies, non-citizens are not citizens in the first place, right? I mean, how is it that we can countenance or, find palatable that kind of disenfranchisement, which is a complete and utter disenfranchisement, which, of course, Europe is especially guilty of in the last few years with the migrant crisis. And yet we are very concerned about the kinds of historical disenfranchisement we may perceive in, scriptural systems like the Islamic tradition and its legal context. Okay, I'm going to aim for, wrapping up in the next 5 minutes or so, inshallah, but let's see how much, please forgive me if I go over a couple of minutes. And another, this is a big one, the problem of sovereignty, like exactly how to define sovereignty. And, it's, if people don't mind me plugging sort of my own work, I should have an article coming out on the question of sovereignty, in over the summer period with the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society. But I think it's one of the big questions, I mean, of our time, in a sense, for Muslims and for all peoples to a certain extent. So in any case, I think, Islam's, as I've mentioned, this is my friend Roshan Abbasi from Harvard, or now at Yale, who, if you're interested in an alternative history of the secular, so to speak, I think his work is really excellent. And I also wanted to point out Noah Feldman, points out that the political realm in Islamic history was actually subordinated to the Sharia, meaning, I mean, one of the things that he mentions is that in a sort of way that was unprecedented in European history at the time, the caliph was seen as subordinate to the rule of law, which was in the control of the Sharia. And this is not something that you actually found in, for example, Roman, I think he refers to Roman law specifically, where it says explicitly the emperor is beyond the sort of rule of law. And so, you have this entire situation which is so contrastively different that it's, without that historical consciousness and that familiarity and that attempt to avoid ethnocentrism and Eurocentrism, these desires to just, pull a system out of Europe and plug it into the Muslim context, I think is, not just anachronistic, but it's actually, it does violence to the indigenous traditions. Of course, Europe's engagement with the rest of the world has been predicated on that kind of violence for several centuries. So in a sense, as perhaps Europe and by extension its sort of settler colonies, whether they be in North America or in Australia, as they come to a greater consciousness of the way in which they are themselves contingent. And, that's one of the roles that we should be playing as people who are, in a sense, communities in Europe, but not of European history necessarily. That's part of our job, to point out that kind of dimension of European, these claims of European exceptionalism. Let me conclude, and I actually had a whole bunch of other things to think about, but maybe I can bring them in. I actually didn't end up putting them in the slides because time was a bit short, unfortunately, but hopefully I can come back to them in the course of the discussion as well. But what does this all mean for modern Muslims? We have Muslims haven't really been in the driver's seat of their own history in recent centuries, certainly in the past century or so. And I would want to suggest that we have to think and actually develop a perspective and an outlook on a lot of these questions that is sophisticated, that is mature, that is familiar with our own history, first and foremost, I would say, and then the history of Europe and other civilizations, as it were. But it also will differ between Muslim majority and Muslim minority contexts. So, the way in which we think about secularity and the public sphere and religion should be different in Muslim majority contexts and Muslim minority contexts. In a Muslim majority, right now, the Muslim majority situation is not great very often. It's not universally the case, but Muslim majority post-colonial states, as they are often secular autocracies. And where they are not, they are extremely constrained, Muslim democracies that have to operate in a global order where the nation state is presumptively secular in a kind of Eurocentric sense. But there are attempts to adapt in ways which, Muslims have to show a great deal of creativity and ingenuity in reflecting on what's the most appropriate way to deal with the present. Rupture isn't good. Outright rejection of a secular order does not give an answer as to what will replace it. And those sorts of transitions should be gradual and, try not to create disruption in a way that will affect millions of people's lives, perhaps billions of people's lives. The mainstream Islamist project is an interesting rejection of the secular autocracy model, which is dominant in parts of the Middle East, which I study, for example. And you also have this major problem, which, this is kind of a brief reference to my other work, which is you have state-sponsored ulama who have emerged. And I consider these people to be in some respects quite unprecedented in Islamic history, as rubber stamps for autocracy. Okay, sorry, I don't know. That should say in some cases, not in some cases. I apologize for that. And finally, just as a concluding point, and as I say, I've got sort of other notes written which I can sort of share, but I would like to open the floor up, and I'd like to give as much time as possible to questions and answers. But ultimately, we really need to, spend a lot of time thinking, but also developing practices that will allow these alternative paradigms to really flower going on, into the future, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. Apologies if I went a little long, but I hope that was of interest, and inshallah, if there's any benefit to what I've said, it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Barakallahu feekum.